they're turning into side streets here. People are absolutely terrified. This is the first time that the protesters have retreated in major numbers, and for a very obvious reason, they're being fired at directly here. That seems people having turned the corner onto side streets to get away from the gunfire now appear to be regrouping. But there's still thousands of people now streaming down Chang'an Boulevard, going towards the east, moving very, very quickly, people running, people on bicycles. The gunfire stopped for a moment. We can still see fires burning further up the square, but that appears to have been firing directly at the crowd and breaking them up. The scenes of panic that we have not so far witnessed in spite of all the other measures taken by the security forces. We see one solitary bus driving against this human tide in towards the square, and also one ambulance with its lights flashing and the siren blaring. People are now running frantically. People on bicycles, rickshaw pullers, people in pedicabs. It's an absolute mob scene. The crowd now in retreat. One bus still moving forward. I can see somebody carrying an injured person. There's an ambulance just immediately in front of where I am, surrounded now by a group of people. The ambulance trying to turn around and get away from Tiananmen Square. We can see Molotov cocktails being thrown on Chang'an Street by the demonstrators. Little flashes of light. A huge human mass surging down Chang'an Street, trying to get away from the gunfire of the Chinese army.
All right, Mike Chinoy, thank you very much. Firing has broken out and panic has set in, as Mike has been reporting. We're going to take a break and come back with our complete coverage of what's happening in Beijing at a little after 2 a.m. in the morning. We'll be back. Mike Chinoy.
Yes, at this moment, the crowd, portion of the crowd that had been in Tiananmen Square broke and ran as gunfire was turned on them by the Chinese army. You can hear these ambulances now racing through the streets. We have seen people on carts being wheeled out of Tiananmen Square and loaded into ambulances. We saw one person hit in the head, and it looked very much like that person was dead, although obviously we can't confirm that. More and more ambulances, the crowd, large portion of it, still flowing down Chang'an Avenue to the east, away from the gunfire of the troops in the center of the square. But as best we can tell, there are still a lot of people in the square. These people seem to have been in the road in Chang'an Street. This is the latest development in an attack on the square that has been gathering strength for most of the evening. It's now about 20 after 2 in the morning on Sunday here in Beijing, and for several hours the army has been moving in. There have been violent confrontations at a number of points elsewhere in the city, confrontations that have involved gunfire, bayonet charges, confrontations that have left some people dead and many people wounded. The precise figures are very hard to come by. And now the troops have opened fire, as best we can tell, directly on the demonstrators' mass, right in front of the famous portrait of Chairman Mao on the Gate of Heavenly Peace, prompting them to break ranks and retreat back. But they are not leaving the vicinity. They're retreating back to protect themselves, but there's no indication that they're giving up and going home. This is a confrontation that is likely to be playing itself out for many hours to come.
So, Mike, you saying the protesters have moved down Penang Avenue or Penang Street and are kind of regrouping, thinking about maybe coming back into the square?
Whether they'll try to go back is hard to say, but the group that broke up, which I must say, who have not moved. This was a large crowd at the edge of the square on Chang'an Boulevard, right near the rostrum of the Gate of Heavenly Peace. And when the fire was directed in their direction at them, they broke and ran in panic down the street, some of them seeking refuge on side streets. But having sought that refuge, the flow has eased a little bit, and there's no sign that these people are all just giving up. There's still a lot of fight in these people. And in the square itself, as I said, there were many people.
What's happening now into the Steve Coast and find out about our weather across the country. Steve. President Bush is taking the day off in Maine after a vigorous and successful week among his allies in Europe. How realistic?
Stop. Now it's picked up again down towards the square. Thousands of troops poured out of the entrance to the Forbidden City on the north side of the square and moved into the square. We also have reports that troops were firing from the roof of the Great Hall of the People and the roof of Chairman Mao's mausoleum, although we cannot confirm that. There are reports from eyewitnesses that in the southern corner of the square that troops bayoneted protesters. This, ironically, right near Mao's mausoleum and the Colonel Sanders Kentucky Fried Chicken joint venture restaurant. As the crowd stream back now, some of them are regrouping and chanting, waving flags, but from my vantage point, the top part of the square, which has been a sea of people for 3 weeks, is now clear. The troops are slowly trying to establish their control over the square. That's the latest for the moment. I'm Mike Chenoy, CNN, reporting live from Beijing.
Mr. Secretary, before we move on, in light of this stronger action, does the U.S. have
front of the Gate of Heavenly Peace, and they were shooting at the crowds, and the crowds were retreating back to the east.
I don't know about how many students are around that monument. Any idea? You can picture that?
I would say about 1,000 students are left around the monument. There are crowds gathered around. The square is huge, and there is a sort of a no man's land between them and where the crowds are trying to keep the troops at bay. But they weren't succeeding very well. The troops have incredible firepower. There's been shooting the last couple of hours. We saw at first tracers in the distance coming over the Mao Mausoleum. They moved in gradually. An APC or two came by. The students had earlier tried to stop the troops who were on foot, and they managed to stop an occasional group of 300 or 1,000, but they couldn't stop the troop trucks.
All right, Donald Liu reporting live from Beijing. We're going now to the State Department where Bob Franken is standing by for a reaction.
Line of soldiers across Chang'an Street, the main boulevard leading into the square. There are different reports about how many protesters remain inside the square. One of our colleagues who was there put the number at perhaps 1,000. Others put it at somewhat higher. In any event, those people are surrounded by the soldiers and don't have any way out. They're effectively prisoners. However, elsewhere in the city, we are getting reports that there are large crowds out on the streets, and barricades that were put up earlier in the evening continue to remain on many major street corners and intersections throughout Beijing. This was an attempt earlier by the people to prevent the army from reaching the square. Clearly that attempt did not succeed, but the security forces now are going to have a big problem. Having secured the square, they still are going to have to take over control of much of the rest of the city where there are still a lot of people out. As the battle for Tiananmen Square was taking place on Chinese television, a statement was broadcast about 2:45 in the morning here, our time, that's about 1:45 in the afternoon Eastern time, by an announcer saying that a serious counter-revolutionary rebellion had taken place, attacking and attempting to overthrow the government of China and the socialist system. It said those who refused to listen to reason would be responsible for the consequences, and it claimed that thousands of armed police and soldiers had been wounded and that some had been killed, and also acknowledged that some citizens in the streets had been wounded and killed as well. So that's the way the government is playing this crisis, calling it a serious counter-revolutionary rebellion, against the socialist system. The crackdown is likely to go on for some time because, as I said, much of the city remains not under government control. We get reports of truckloads of soldiers whizzing along many of the major arteries, and also of crowds of protesters and barricades on many of the major streets. It could be a long and even bloodier struggle as dawn breaks here in Beijing before the authorities are able to finally secure control over the capital. David?
Thank you, Mike. That is CNN's Mike Chinoy, live by telephone from Beijing. When we come back, the U.S. perspective, live from the State Department.
CNN's Mike Chinoy is in the midst of the chaos in Beijing and brings us this live report from Beijing. Mike, have the soldiers taken over the square?
The soldiers have now taken over Tiananmen Square. The protest there is finished, squelched. There is still some gunfire going on sporadically around the square. From my vantage point, I can hear shots going off every few minutes. A few moments ago, an enormous column of tanks, armored personnel carriers, and troop trucks came rumbling down Chang'an Boulevard towards Tiananmen Square. It seemed to stretch endlessly for dozens and dozens of vehicles stretching for miles. There was quite a bit of gunfire as the convoy passed. The crowds that were still in the streets scattered in panic as the vehicles rumbled along the street, some of the crowds leaping over fences, racing into nearby buildings to seek shelter. However, as soon as that convoy passed, some of the crowds went back out on the streets, and they are now burning a bus at an intersection near Tiananmen Square in a gesture of defiance. In the square itself, the troops do appear to be in complete control. They gained that control at considerable cost in human life. We don't have exact casualty figures, but we estimate that the dead must run into the dozens and the wounded into the hundreds at least. People were being shot at random all over the place all night long. It's now a little after 6 in the morning, and the first reports of gunfire we have were well over 6 hours ago, and there was gunfire all over Beijing, not just in Tiananmen Square, although the final assault and the deadliest assault was in Tiananmen Square. Troops are now reportedly moving out elsewhere around the city, manning key intersections and places where there are traffic lights, checking vehicles and passers-by, although we are told that there are still barricades and protesters up also at several points around the city, and it may take a while before those are cleared. But it was the battle in Tiananmen, the battle for the heart of the city, the heart of China, that dominated the bloody events of the past several hours. My colleague Bruce Kennedy was right in the middle of that for much of the worst of it. And he joins us now. Bruce, tell us what happened or what it was like.
Well, Mike, for 2 hours I spent time in a scene that I can only describe as hellish. This all began about 5 hours ago in Tiananmen when troops began to converge on 3 sides of the square. There were reports of tanks and armored personnel carriers behind the Great Wall of People, which is on the western side of the Great Hall of the People, on the western side of the square. Government loudspeakers told the students that they must all leave the area or they could not guarantee the safety or lives of anyone left in Tiananmen. The students remained calm, however, in spite of distant gunfire and tracer bullets that we could see from behind Mao's tomb. The actual shooting in the square didn't begin for about a half hour. Students came running up to me and were reporting about many casualties, lots of people being shot dead, including a little girl. We actually saw about 7 casualties being taken into the Red Cross tent the students had erected in the center of the square. It's something that struck me. A Chinese photographer came running up to me at one point and showed me his camera bag. He had been hit by a bullet, but miraculously the camera bag had saved him and it only shattered his lens. Very strange scenes. The students were incredibly brave. They were fighting live ammunition with rocks and stones, and at one point even tried to block an advancing column of about 30 armored troop carriers with a public bus. We could see the people inside the bus being taken off and beaten, and an armored personnel carrier was also set on fire, I guess by the students, though we couldn't tell. Otherwise, it was rather amazing.
Bruce, could you see how close the soldiers were to the students when they opened fire?
No, I decided that discretion was a better part of valor at that point. They had surrounded three sides of the square and were apparently ready to block us off in the back. They were, however, the students were right up against the soldiers and ready to confront them. I mean, they were practically face to face with them and chanting slogans that I could not discern.
So there is certainly a chance that these shots, which caused so many of the casualties, could well have been fired at close range, if not more or less point-blank range.
I would say most definitely point-blank to close range. It was a very tense scene. A lot of the students, something else that struck me, at the monument to the martyrs of the Revolution, many of the students were just sitting there waiting. I've spoken with students over the past week, and many of them said to me that they would not mind dying for their cause, perhaps becoming martyrs themselves. And so there was a lot of passivity on the students, but there was a certain amount of enthusiasm to meet these people. You'd hear the loudspeakers ordering people into various places. Students could be seen being deployed by their security system, fanning out all over the place.
And how did you make your escape, and under what kind of conditions?
Well, I don't want to give too much of that away. I'll just say that I was fortunate enough to find some very dark back streets. I had a couple of close brushes with police, and through the help of a very good Chinese person with a car, or actually a vehicle, I was able to drive into the outlying areas where I can confirm your report. I kept my head down and tried to be as inconspicuous as possible, and I saw many roadblocks, many Chinese on the street, but just sort of standing and talking and watching, but also many troops deployed on highways, not threatening, but sitting within their various troop carriers and just waiting to see what would happen.
Okay, thank you. Bruce Kennedy, CNN producer, who was in the heart of Tiananmen Square at the height of the bloodshed and managed with considerable ingenuity and good luck to get away unscathed. It is now dawn here. The light has come back. The night is finished, and the scene around Tiananmen is one of desolation and shock. There are still crowds in the streets, but the army is in command. The gunfire continues. We cannot trace all of it. A bus is burning. People are smashing the windows on a bus. There are still crowds out in the streets. It is extraordinary, despite the show of force, that there is anybody willing to stick their neck out at this stage of the game, because that is risking very high likelihood of death or injury, and yet people are continuing to do it. The crackdown is going to take many more hours, if not days, before it is complete, before we will know how many people have died, how many people have been wounded, and just what kind of damage China's hopes for economic and political reform, for taking its place as a respected member of the international community, all of those kinds of issues must suffer enormous consequences from what has happened here, but that's for the future. For the moment, the iron fist of the People's Liberation Army has come down on Tiananmen Square. In the heart of Beijing, the student protest has been crushed.
Mike or Bruce, if you can hear me, a couple of points I wish you could clarify. We are told that some of the diehard students are still at the center of Tiananmen Square, and they're announcing that you have to give your life to the cause. Are they still holding out in the center of the square? There are also reports that there are hundreds of thousands of Chinese around, outside the square. Can you tell us about both of these activities?
Well, let me say that we have had reports that there were some students left in the center of the square, but the impression we had is that, however defiant their attitude may be, they're essentially prisoners, that the soldiers have control of the square, the students are no longer